Good evening, everyone. I'm Nayaswami Asha, and it's a great joy to be sharing with you tonight. This is the third of our three-part series on the mission of the Masters and the Masters of our path. And tonight what I thought I would do would be just to consider one at a time each of the 5 gurus that we have on our altar, and just talk a little bit about the gift and the vibration of each one of them and how they can help us on our spiritual journey. Swamiji has commented on several occasions how really unusual it is to have 5 avatars in a line on the altar. Master called them our guru preceptors, and he often spoke of this line of gurus. We tend to think of guru as a singular individual with whom we have a unique relationship. But Master, in a most interesting way, often referred to our line of gurus. And there is, therefore, an extraordinary power, cumulative power, brought to us by each of these masters. And most of us who are on this spiritual path have pictures of all of them somewhere in our lives. I know when I was living in my small trailer in my early years at Ananda village, there was a shelf above the window, and I had each of the 5 masters on the shelf there. And then my bed was right underneath. And one night, for reasons that I have no idea what caused it or anything at all, just in the middle of the night, Babaji fell right on my chest. And I just took it as a sign that I needed to tune into him more. And so I tried to follow what seemed to be his instructions to me at that point. Well, why don't we go with this in sequence, starting first with the image of Jesus as the first in our line of masters. Master tells the story that this entire lineage and this entire new expression of self-realization was catalyzed by Jesus Christ. As I was speaking earlier in this series, Swami Kriyananda has quite seriously raised what he believes to be the truth that, in fact, Yogananda was Jesus Christ in a previous incarnation. But let's just take Jesus on his own terms. Many of us feel a great attunement with his life and mission, speaking especially for myself. When we come to the Easter story, less so at Christmas, but when we come to the Easter story, it's not as if I have past life recollections, but when I start talking about what was happening at that time, I really feel myself to be on the streets. I feel myself to have been one of those disciples and watching that story unfold with all the extraordinary drama of it. And the life of Jesus is, to a large extent, confused by the church. And I don't just mean the Catholic Church, but I mean churchianity is what Yogananda called it. He came to teach what he called original Christianity, and he made a distinction between the original teachings of Jesus and churchianity, which has more or less replaced it. All of the ways that institutionalized religion, even if sincerely meant, has distorted the sort of pure simplicity and power of who Jesus was himself. Often I find that the way to understand Jesus is really to understand through the stories. Swami Kriyananda once referred to the life of Jesus as the greatest story ever told, which is a cliche almost. That's how everyone refers to it. And I said to Swamiji, really, do you really think so? And then I remember he looked at me with so much wonder in his eyes. He says, oh yes, don't you think it is? And Swamiji said later, interestingly, when he was writing about Yogananda's life, and when he was first sort of contemplating the writing of the book, The Path, his own autobiography, he said there was a certain part of him that he wasn't sure how to go about it, because in a certain way the story of Master's life is not all that dramatic. I mean, it's dramatic in the sense of him coming to America and creating this great work, but not like the drama of the life of Jesus. But Swamiji was talking about how in the life of Jesus, the story of his life, to a very large extent, was his teaching. Partly because it was Kali Yuga, and things had to be very explicit for society as a whole to grasp what the message is. Master's life, lacking that kind of dramatic episode, the teachings that he brought were able to stand out more strongly because they weren't simply buried by the dramatic events. But the life of Jesus being his teaching has to do with courage in the face of persecution, this amazing strength of will to be able to declare a reality that even though all the forces of society and all those that were looked up to with power and money totally stood against him, nonetheless he never flinched. And Swamiji points out that in many of the statements that Jesus made, if you understand his personality in a proper way, you realize that he was being humorous, he was being, he was playing with the crowd, he was never flinching no matter what happened. And the idea of visualizing the power and the presence of Jesus in terms of the personality of Yogananda is a very helpful one. I have to say, without wanting to exaggerate the point, the fact that I've had so many years, have had so many years of experience with Swami Kriyananda and got to watch in a very up-close way the consciousness of a great soul interacts with the world around him and the way he works with people and responds to circumstances. And Swami Kriyananda certainly had his share of adversity and persecution and challenge. Because we're in early Dwapara, it didn't act out in his life and in our life the way it acted out in the life of Jesus and his disciples. But it was the equivalent to a very large extent. It was through the law courts that his life and work was an attempt was made to eradicate his life and work. In the life of Jesus, when the priesthood decided that he was a threat to their teaching and above all to their power, they took him to court also, but they were able to have him condemned to death. And there was Jesus just having to not merely sacrifice his life in a theoretical sense or in a symbolic sense, but just literally to give up his physical body, so that the whole drama of the resurrection and his return and all of that could be acted out again. And never once did he flinch, not once. From the very beginning, when he was from the beginning of that week, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was praying all night because he knew what was coming, and his own disciples didn't have the strength not to fall asleep. He asked them to stay up and pray with him, and they couldn't do it. And he said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So even his own disciples weren't able, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, were not able to stand with him, but no hint of censure came from him. He just stood for the truth. And then finally the armed cohort of Roman soldiers came to arrest him. And one of his disciples picked up a sword to fight. And Jesus said, don't defend me in that way. He said, if my Father wanted to spare me, he could send legions of angels to rescue me. But this is what is destined. And when one of my favorite parts of that story, I say that about many parts of the story, but one of my favorite parts of the story is when the Roman soldiers, now picture this, Jesus is in this garden where he often went, and he's there with his disciples. He's been up most of the night praying. They've been dozing on and off. And then all of a sudden this armed guard marches into it. It's just a garden, like a public park. This armed guard, these Roman soldiers march up to him, and in their midst is Judas, one of Jesus's own, one of his 12, one of his chosen apostles. And Jesus, and now he's with the armed Roman soldiers, leading those soldiers right to where Jesus is. And he's stand there, and he knows why they've come, because he had an omniscient consciousness, and he knew what his life was going to be. He knows why they've come. He knows Jesus is standing in the midst of them. There he is right in front, and then the story is told that in order to identify him from the crowd, Judas kissed Jesus on the cheek. Imagine. And then the soldiers came at him, and Jesus stepped toward them. Now, I mean, the natural thing to do would at least be make them come and get you, but instead he stepped toward them, and the force of his personality was so great, and of his consciousness, that he knocked the soldiers over backwards. He didn't touch them, he just stepped forward. And it wasn't just, an ordinary step. It was Jesus embracing wholeheartedly, with every ounce of his infinite power, the destiny that God had given him. And of course, then the story goes on from there. But that's who we're dealing with when we deal with Jesus, right in the center of our altar. I mean, forget blessed Jesus, meek and mild. This is the whole power of the universe concentrated with courage and divine acceptance in adversity. I mean, we can look to the life of each of these masters in many different ways, so I'm just pulling out one small piece of it. Power in the face of adversity, courage in the face of opposition, absolute unwavering commitment to the truth of what you were born to do, no matter who supports you or not. And each of these masters, you see, this whole line of gurus, gives us the opportunity at different times in our lives, different phases of our lives, or different moments in our day, or just when different things are happening to us. We have all these different kinds of power we can draw upon in different ways over the course of a long sadhana, a life of sadhana, which is our lives of sadhana, to just find, that exact vibration which moves us and lifts us. And of course, the other side of that courage that Jesus showed was his absolute love. There on the cross, literally on the cross, he looks at those who have done this to him, and he knows what they have done. He knows the karma of having turned on the messenger of God in this way. And he offers a prayer. He intercedes for them. He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was interceding on their behalf, that the karmic consequences of their own actions, that they be spared. He put himself between them and those consequences. Courage and compassion. That would be two words we could use to describe Jesus. And then after Jesus in our line of gurus, we have Babaji Krishna. And that's how Master used to pray to Babaji. He put him with Krishna. Now, Master in a previous life had been Arjuna, and Master's true guru was Babaji. Sri Yukteswar stood in for Babaji. And that's a mystery that is beyond me to unravel, so I can only speak of it in that way. But Master, whenever he spoke of Babaji, he was also remembering his own incarnation as Arjuna with Krishna on the field of Kurukshetra and the whole extraordinarily dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita. So again, we have to put these two characters together. Krishna is really lost in mythology, so to speak. The power that we have of him, besides all those glorious stories, those romantic in the sense of divine love stories, and the extraordinary beauty of Krishna. Krishna is always presented as being so beautiful. Garlands of flowers, cascades of peacock feathers, gold ornaments, beautiful silks. Of course, Krishna was a living person. Krishna was a title, just like Christ. Christ and Krishna. Master used to often say Krishna to try to get the words to look the same. Krishna and Krishna, saying it was the same title. But there's a sweetness to those stories of Krishna. But his real consciousness is put forth in the Bhagavad Gita, of course, which has endured all this time because of that extraordinary truth between Arjuna and Krishna. So you also realize, because of what Master said, that everything about Arjuna was also Master. And then as Babaji, as Krishna, he lived as a king in a physical body, in a visible way. As Babaji, he's retired to the Himalayas and is the avatar for avatars in a sense. He's the guiding force, Master says, of this spiritual age. I don't mean solitarily, but that's the role that he's taken. He, rather than playing a public role, and this is how Master explains Babaji to us, that whereas most avatars appear for a time in a physical body that operates more in keeping with ordinary physical laws. And Jesus was a child, he grew up, he was a man, he was killed, his body was killed by the means that would normally kill a physical body. Jesus then resurrected that body and returned to show that death had no mastery over him. The Son of Man could be killed, meaning his physical form, but the Son of God, meaning his Christ consciousness, transcended all physical laws. Well, Babaji now in this cycle has taken this role of this remote Himalayan ascetic. And the picture of Babaji that Master had his brother draw from his own seeing of Babaji, with the long hair and the youthful face and usually very simply dressed, is a picture of a life that none of us can live at this time. There's very little in the expression of that incarnation that we can actually pull into our own lives. He lives in the Himalayan peaks. He can move from peak to peak by means of astral travel. His body is ever youthful. He's made the promise that he'll hold that physical form until this whole cycle of manifestation is done. Where do we put those thoughts in our minds? But then we balance it on the other side by this extreme compassionate, and there comes that word again, compassionate concern for the welfare of all of us. Anyone who is unfortunate enough to keep up with the news or read the newspapers these days just can't help but be appalled by the state of the world, made anxious, confused, concerned, the level of greed, just stunning levels of greed, and power-seeking and brutality. Well, I don't need to enumerate it. But then Master writes about Babaji and how Babaji and Jesus together are deeply concerned over the overall direction of society. And Babaji is thinking about how to help us. So even though he's at this great distance from us, and there's one of the quotes in the autobiography of a yogi where Babaji says, "I perceive many saints in Europe and America waiting to be awakened." So that simple statement alone, I perceive, he says, which means his consciousness is wherever we are. And then Master says in Autobiography of a Yogi, whoever says the name of Babaji with devotion draws to himself an instant blessing. Now just think about that for a moment. Anyone, anywhere, of course it's always true. With any expression of divinity. But Master writes this book, which has been literally read by millions. And he tells these stories of this remarkable yogi and how that remarkable yogi is ever living in a youthful body. But if we pray to him with devotion, we draw to ourselves an instant blessing. Swamiji tells a story from his life at Mount Washington when one of the monks was working on something, and he was faced with a certain difficulty, or he had some difficulty with Master. The details I can't quite remember, but they don't really matter. In any case, he had an exchange with Master. And then Master walked out of the room, and the monk decided to pray to Babaji. And Master came back in and said to the monk, "No fare going over my head." Of course, Babaji being Master's own guru. I mean, that's what he was saying. But the power is always there. You know, I think what Babaji is here to teach us, well, it's manifold. He's here to absolutely challenge our own sense of limitation. That would be true also of what I said about Jesus. All of these masters present that to us. This picture of who not only that we could be, but that we will be. As Jesus put it, that which I do, ye shall do, and greater things. So when we think of Babaji being so remote and being so much more able in every possible way, we have to realize that he's not there to create a sense of awe in us only, but he's also there to show us that this is the path that we too have to walk, and this is the path that we want to walk. And I just love having that idea in our mind of this utter world-renouncing yogi who, as he described himself to Sri Yukteswar when he appeared to Sri Yukteswar under the banyan tree, and Sri Yukteswar wanted him to come to his ashram, and we are people who prefer the shelter of trees, is how Babaji put it. Just that picture of simplicity and attunement. I had a realization once when I was thinking about the Yugas early on and just trying to get my mind around it, that it's hard for people to believe in these higher ages because they don't find any evidence of it. And quite apart from the fact that time can destroy everything, I realized, but you see, the higher the age, the less evidence there is. I mean, these big, heavy concrete bridges that we built, and these big buildings, and all of this dense material stuff that we have to create, that's not really a sign of our advancement compared to self-realization. That's actually a sign of our limitations, that we're not comfortable in the outdoors, we're not attuned to nature, we're not capable of controlling our own bodies sufficiently to not protect them with all this enormous structure, that the higher the age, the less disturbance there is to the natural world, because the human being having self-mastery can just blend easily into the natural world. So among many other aspects of the life of Babaji, what you see in him is you see absolute freedom from the necessity to burden his reality with anything material. His consciousness alone. He can take his body anywhere it needs to go, and just within himself is the power to withstand heat and cold, to cover distance, to transcend time. And it's thrilling just to meditate on what it feels like to be that free. And that's what Babaji gives us. He gives us this picture of absolute freedom from everything in this world that we think that we need, and which in fact we do need. And so whenever we feel burdened or like as if we lack, meditating on Babaji and just tuning into the pure bliss of, well, I'll use Swamiji's chant, I need nothing, I am free. In myself, I am free. And that's one of the gifts among many that Babaji gives us. And now you have the most interesting contrast between the life of Babaji and what he represents, and the next in our line of masters, which is his direct disciple, Lahiri Mahasaya. It's as if they sort of decided to be opposite sides of the spectrum. There's an interesting feature which I can only repeat, of course, not having any visual experience of either. that they say that Babaji resembled Lahiri Mahasaya, or Lahiri resembled Babaji, and that as Lahiri's life progressed and his body grew older, but Babaji's never changed, that whenever those who had the opportunity either to see them at the same time or see one or the other, see both of them at different times, realized that Babaji began to look like Lahiri's son, except that his hair, of all things, Babaji's hair is, they describe it as copper-colored, reddish. Who can understand why or what? But Lahiri Mahasaya, in contrast to the extremely dramatic unfamiliarity to the ordinary person of the life that Babaji lived, Lahiri was on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's true that Sri Yukteswar at one point was married, which is peculiar in itself, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But Lahiri was married through his whole life. Lahiri was born in, ordinary circumstances, and up to the age of, I think it was 32, when he finally met Babaji, or around that age, he followed what looked like just an ordinary career. He was married, he had children, he worked as an accountant for the government, and he had his home and his work and his service and his family. His life just rolled on in the form that anybody could relate to. In himself, he was an avatar. He was always free. When Swamiji asked Master, when he was talking to Master about Master's incarnation as William the Conqueror, when he was having to be a king and a warrior and all the effort he had to make in the world to live through and manifest that incarnation, Swami was asking him essentially, do you get caught up in it? How does your consciousness relate to what you're living? Master's response was, inwardly you are always free. And so we have that picture of Sri Yukteswar, and in fact, when he meets Babaji, Babaji talks to him about how as a little child Lahiri was meditating for long hours and burying himself in the sand and sitting under the sun and meditating. So even though we don't have a lot of those stories, at least not in English, not translated into English, Lahiri wasn't an ordinary soul. But the Leela he undertook was to demonstrate that the life of an ordinary householder can be spiritualized as completely and as readily as the life of a world-renouncing ascetic like Babaji. And the whole spirit of Lahiri that's brought forth, and as his personality is described by Sri Yukteswar and by others, was one of extreme gentleness and kindness and humility and a quiet inward living of the task that God has given to him, without drama, without there was no external drama in Lahiri's life. He made no effort to create a work to transform a society. In fact, for reasons known only to the masters, when Lahiri was initiated by Babaji in the Himalayas, as the story is told in Autobiography of a Yogi, and then, even though Lahiri thought, yes, he had a family and a wife and a job, his assumption was that now that he'd met his guru in the Himalayas, that he would renounce all of that and never look back, and was perfectly willing to. He was doing his duty, but inwardly he was always free. But Babaji said, you have a work to do. You have to go back to the life that you were living and then begin to teach this Kriya Yoga, which Babaji had given to him. And Lahiri was the way in which Kriya Yoga was brought out of the Himalayas. You see, the secrets of spiritual power were pulled out of common understanding during the time of Kali Yuga, because society as a whole was too dense, and people's consciousness was too impure to be given that kind of power. And so it was pulled out. It wasn't in books. It wasn't in correspondence courses. It wasn't on the internet. It was pulled out and it was taken to the Himalayas. It was preserved, but it was hidden. And you had to pass many layers of tests and purification and proving of sincerity before you could find your way to those teachings. And in fact, that was the exchange between Babaji and Lahiri. Babaji, as the Himalayan custodian of this teaching, says to Lahiri, you have to go and teach this, but teach it only to those who are willing to renounce everything for God. And then Lahiri, speaking for all of us, and you see this was his mission, and this is why the Leela played out this way, or at least Master tells it to us this way. Lahiri says to Babaji, but so few can do that. There are so few who can renounce everything for God, but so many are suffering, and so many would be benefited from having this Kriya Yoga. And so Babaji says, through you, God has spoken. And so the ancient restrictions were lessened. But they were also announcing, you see, the coming of Dwapara Yuga, the coming of the time when society as a whole was rising to the point where it was not dangerous. It was not dangerous to our welfare to have easier access to these realities. The masters are not punishing us, they're protecting us by keeping these things back until we're ready to have them. But Lahiri comes in, but still he lived a very unobtrusive life. There was no organization. He didn't write anything himself, although others wrote down what he said, and he inspired others to write. And Master came to make Swami called it a beachhead in America, a beachhead in the West of these teachings of self-realization, but Lahiri made no such effort. In fact, he didn't even allow anything to be organized in his name until very close to the end of his life. And in fact, he told those he initiated to keep the initiation a secret and not tell anyone that they'd been initiated. So two people could both be disciples of Lahiri Mahasaya, and unless they happened to meet there, they wouldn't even know that, because he wanted it to be completely private there at the beginning. But everyone who came, who was sincere, he offered it to them freely. And then he just showed and made the footprint, the deep imprint on the ether and on our consciousness that you don't have to renounce the world now. This was an unheard of idea at the time, but partly because of Lahiri Mahasaya's example and the example of Sri Yukteswar sort of pushing this new understanding forward, which Swami Kriyananda, of course, and Master have pulled way out into society now finally. Lahiri set the example. He just showed you can have your family, you can have your wife, your job, your home, everything that you need to do, and Kriya Yoga. And by the practice of Kriya Yoga, in the midst of that God is everywhere. And Master even wrote in Autobiography of a Yogi that the path of the householder, provided that you can do it without egoic attachment, is really the higher path, because you're not necessarily needing the world to adjust to you. You're able to hold your spiritual understanding and then live in any way that you choose. Now, this is also what happens in higher ages, is that the ancient rishis often had families and wives, and they lived in their ashrams. There was no necessity for them to drop out of society. And what we're doing now is we're lifting society as a whole, and Lahiri brought that. And so what Lahiri shows us is an integrated life. And whenever we feel, and that doesn't mean that there's no place for renunciation. I'm a Nayaswami myself, so I totally understand the power of a formal sense of renunciation, but even as a Nayaswami, I live in an ordinary house in the midst of ordinary society. It's just not the time anymore. It's not the necessity anymore for us to cut ourselves off. And so what Lahiri provides for us is this humble, accepting, integrated approach to life. And whenever we're feeling like, oh, it's all too much for me, I can't do it, how can I manage all these things? Just feel Lahiri's consciousness. Just quietly and cleanly and without the slightest hesitation. In his spare time, he organized educational things and financially beneficial things. He just looked around his society and said, how can I serve? And he meditated, and he initiated, and he taught, and he blessed, and then he served the world in whatever ways were available to him. Take him with you in your job and in your work and in your home life, and pray to him and to his example that he can inspire you with the ability to go forward and the ability to live the life as he lived it. Now, his disciple was Sri Yukteswar. And Sri Yukteswar has for all of us this powerfully focused, austere. He reminds us again of the austerity of Babaji. It's very interesting to remember, though, that earlier in his life, Sri Yukteswar was also married, and he had a daughter. And only after his wife died and his daughter was married did he become a Swami, although, interestingly, Babaji conferred on Sri Yukteswar the title of Swamiji much earlier in his life, and as far as we can tell, while he was still married, Babaji called him Swami. That's interesting. We remembered that because when we started the Nayaswami order, we were thinking of how interesting it was that Babaji conferred the title of Swami on one who had a wife, because all of us, many of us who are Nayaswamis, are also married still. But Sri Yukteswar gives us, again, this one-pointed focus. And Sri Yukteswar is a kind of a combination, in a certain sense, of both Lahiri and Babaji, because he has the austerity of Babaji in the way he related to the world, which is that his work in that incarnation was really training Yogananda. And as Master put it himself, Master did not have, his Master, Sri Yukteswar, did not have very many disciples, but through me, meaning Yogananda, he has converted many thousands, many millions, in fact. That by concentrating on that one reality, he put all his power behind Yogananda. And one of the things that is not carried through that much when we hear about Yogananda's teaching is the extent to which Yogananda himself deferred to Sri Yukteswar and often referred to Sri Yukteswar and also to Babaji as the reason and the source of much that he did. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, it's very touching when Richard Wright, who was traveling with Master as his secretary, talks about Master meeting Sri Yukteswar. And fortunately, Richard was there and wrote it. At least we have some of that. Because, of course, Master, to everyone who knew him, was the point of reverence for all of them. But then Master was Sri Yukteswar's disciple and deferred to him and touched his feet and was even disciplined by him from time to time. But there's an exchange there between Master and Sri Yukteswar where Sri Yukteswar's ashram was shabby. Master Sri Yukteswar put out little or no energy to make it elegant in any way. It was his family home, but he saw no reason to keep it fancy in any way. I mean, it was his inherited property is what I mean by that. And they said that there was a roof tile that was so precarious that whenever anyone had to walk under it, they would run past it and say a prayer before they started for fear it was going to fall on their head. And when Master wanted to fix it, Sri Yukteswar just brushed it off and said, it'll stay as long as I live. And after Sri Yukteswar left his body, the tile fell. It was exactly true. So when Master goes back to India and is visiting there with his guru and has, now he has all the resources of the West that he could bring to bear to help his Master. He sees how shabby many things are there. And he says to Sri Yukteswar, I'd like to buy you a new rug. I'd like to fix up this ashram in some way. And Sri Yukteswar points to his meditation place, and he says, my world, which is where I sit to meditate. That's what Sri Yukteswar meant. Where I sit to meditate is fine. And then he kind of gestures to the rest of it, and he says to Yogananda, That's your world, not mine. And he wasn't reprimanding him in any way. He was just saying, it's just not my responsibility. Your responsibility is to create a visible expression of self-realization. But Sri Yukteswar's responsibility was entirely just his own consciousness, the handful of disciples he trained, and above all, Yogananda. And through Yogananda to constantly inspire this outward-reaching work. It's not that Sri Yukteswar was not committed to it, but it simply wasn't his vibration in that lifetime. It wasn't his responsibility in that lifetime. Babaji gave him the assignment of writing the holy science and comparing, the East and the Western teachings and presenting the unified truth of Sanatana Dharma. And he did that work because Babaji asked him to do it. And he carried on a correspondence, Yogananda said, with many people in many countries. So it wasn't that he didn't respond to the needs that came before him, but his life was inward in this incarnation. It was much more about his inner consciousness than anything he did outwardly. So we have again with Sri Yukteswar, when we're thinking about the gifts and the vibrations of each of these masters, it's not so much that Sri Yukteswar was stern, as some people say, or too demanding, or any of those things. Sri Yukteswar's consciousness was inside of him. He lived in the inner reality, and the outer reality was simply not important to him. And that again, there are times when we want to cultivate that quality within ourselves, or we feel ourselves deficit in it, or it's above, it's a spiritual mood that we know would be beneficial to us, to just have that quiet self-sufficiency that simply just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the roof is falling. It doesn't matter if the rug is shabby. We don't have to be concerned about these things. We keep our inner temple. We keep all the altar fires lit on the inner temple, and we have everything that we need. That's a certain kind of wisdom. Now, Lahiri's involved compassion and Master's utter dedication to the creation of the self-realization movement, it's all equally valid. It's just different facets of the same diamond. And as I say, different phases of our life, at different times of the day, at different episodes, whatever it might be, all of these qualities can be made part of our inner consciousness, and everything we need we can find right here on this path. We don't have to go beyond it. And all of these gurus, and you have from the beginning, Jesus appeared to the great Master Babaji, and we have to do something for my followers in the West. And the end of that, Sri Yukteswar training Yogananda, him going out and doing his school for a while, and then that just remarkable scene, no matter how you think about it, of Master meditating and seeing all these faces in front of him, and Americans, these must be Americans. I'm called to America, just like that. And that afternoon, he was on his way to America. And he goes, though, to get the blessings of his guru, the blessings of Sri Yukteswar. Although before he was willing to leave, he also demanded the blessings of Babaji, and Babaji came and affirmed that it was the moment. But Master receives an invitation to go to Boston, and he goes to Sri Yukteswar. What should I do? Master says, Sri Yukteswar says, it's now. Now is the moment. All doors are open. Don't forget that you were born a Hindu, but don't become an American. Take the best of all cultures, and be a man of self-realization. And Master just takes off. He's a young man in his 20s, and he comes to America. He's invited to this Congress, so he has a point of beginning. And his father gives him a large sum of money. As his father says, not as your father, but as a disciple of Lahiri Mahasaya, I give you this work for the sake of spreading Kriya Yoga throughout the world. Isn't that just, it's such a beautiful story. And Master's father himself was acting against his own heart, his own human heart, because his human heart wanted to do everything he could to keep his son from leaving. But his disciple's heart, in the name of supporting the work of the masters, he gave Master the capacity to go to America and to live as long as he needed until his work was established and there was another way for him to be able to live in that country. So Master comes with this, in my own mind, I tend to see Master as at the last years of his life. And I realize because we see him so much through, I see him so much through Swamiji's mind. And seeing him through Swamiji's mind, it was the last years of his life, the wisdom years, the somewhat withdrawn years. But you see, Master came when he was in his 20s. And Dr. Lewis was the same age as him. And they were these extraordinary dynamic men. And Master was this extraordinary dynamic man. Not only did he have the consciousness of an avatar, but he had the youth and that adventure and that power and that commitment. And he crisscrossed the country. We have this one day in the history of, on this day in history about Yogananda's life that you can get from ananda.org if you're not getting it now. Master was everywhere. And talking about India, the literature of India, the ancient traditions, the science of India, the art of India, how to be success in this. And you can just feel that overwhelming creative power that just took into his embrace the entire country. And what Master gives us is just this super conscious confidence that we can approach any reality, and with the power and the inspiration of God, we can embrace it, we can transform it, we can solve any problem, we can have inspiration at will. We read his Whispers from Eternity, which he told us to read. After I am gone, read my Whispers from Eternity, in which his ebullience for God, his enthusiasm, just words after words, just spill out like a waterfall with this passionate love for God. Master sets the tone for our whole path. We're not black and white. We're full color. And most of all, what we're full color about is our devotion. That's what Master gives so beautifully. And that was his message, or that was one of his messages, but a beautifully important one. Divine Mother, worship the Divine Mother. Worship with your heart. Love with all that you have. Be confident in your loving. Be fulsome in your devotion. And Master's own chanting, his prayers, his writings, his poetry, all of that he gives out to us. And don't hold back. That's what Master has to say to us. Don't hold back. Swami wrote it so beautifully. Give life your heart. Fear not the loving. All this world's your own. That's how Master lived. That's the power he can give us. Whenever we're feeling tepid in our enthusiasm, turn on a recording of Master's voice and just feel what it feels to give everything you are to God and in service to his cause. And that's the power that Master has to offer us. Now, I've had a couple of questions come in while I was talking, so perhaps I'll answer those and then go on if there's more to say.
The first question is, do you hold any hope of Babaji showing up again for us in the flesh?
Well, I think the question is whether Babaji can show up again to us in the flesh. Babaji could show up any moment, anywhere. Absolutely. Do I personally hold out hope? I'm not concerned one way or another. If he decided to come to me, I would be delighted to see him. But it's not something that I even think about personally. It's not important to me. But if it's important to you, if it's something that you really feel is from your inner self, is a divine longing, Babaji can materialize in an instant, faster than we can say those words. If if it would be of spiritual benefit to whoever needs that, there's no limit to his capacity. So there's no question of holding out hope. It's a metaphysical fact. It's a devotional fact. Whether he will or not is a question of his own sense of whether the fact that one desires that is actually beneficial to you spiritually. So in that sense, it would just have to be, thy will, not mine, be done. Express your desire and then surrender it completely. And let God have the last word, is what I would say. So, the other question?
When Swami spent an extended time in the Himalayas, did he share anything about being with Babaji in meditation or otherwise?
I believe Swamiji has never spoken of seeing Babaji. I wouldn't want to say that he never saw Babaji. I never heard him speak of seeing him. But that doesn't mean that he didn't come to him. Swamiji often commented that Master himself told Swamiji that many things would be withheld from Swamiji in this life and would not be given to him until death. That he would realize God, he would become completely free. But Master's words, which none of us have ever quite been able to decipher, were, death will be the final sacrifice. So Swamiji often commented that he just didn't have the kind of world, the kind of stepping completely out of this world experiences that really a person of his realization should have had. The reasons for that were, well, they could be many karmic reasons, but a very obvious reason, which Swami himself was quick to point out, is if he'd had those kinds of experiences, his incentive to work in this world would not have been great. I mean, he related to this world because it was his duty to do so. But there was no personal compelling need to do so. So those experiences were withheld from him so that he would continue to just do that work until it was done. And so I think toward the end of his life, more of that came to him. Swamiji also never wandered in the Himalayas. He spent time in seclusion when he was younger, but he never walked through the mountains in the pictures that we have in mind of what it means to wander in the Himalayas. And then he was in India for only 4 years when he was expelled from SRF, and he was expelled in 1962. And then he was prevented from going back to India for 10 years. And then after that, he only visited occasionally, a few months here and a few months there. And then when he finally went back to India, he was 78 years old or 76 years old. So there was no opportunity at that point. It was beyond him to do so. Did Babaji respond to him? On a number of occasions, Swamiji spoke of that, of praying to Babaji and feeling his response. So that's what really matters, is that if we can call to the Master and the Master guides us, that's what we're really looking for. We think we would be more powerful if we had these experiences, but I don't know whether we would be or not. Certainly it would confirm our faith. But there's a lot of power in acting as if you had faith, in bringing that faith to you. The primary and final lesson that these masters give us is explained in the Festival of Light, when Swamiji says, "Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world." I mean, that's just such a beautiful statement of what their reality is, that they have no necessity to come back, but they come back out of compassion. As Master writes, I'll come back 1 trillion times if necessary on bleeding feet over crags of suffering, as long as one stray brother is left behind. They assume the karma of their disciples. They assume the karma of the age in which they have lived. They assume the karma of the incarnation that they have a necessity to play out. But inwardly, they're always free. But they do embrace limitation, pain, and death. They live the same lives that we live, but they live it with a perfect consciousness. So all of those things still happen. The betrayals, the disappointments, the enormous effort, the constant battle between light and darkness. They participate in it with everything that they have, but they do it only for the sake of others, only for our salvation. But then, in the Festival of Light, right after we've just felt this glorious gratitude and admiration for the Masters, the Festival of Light has been building with the first stage and the second stage and the third stage of the soul's long journey away from its home in God and then back. And so after we speak of greater can no love be than this, of the Masters, such ever has been the sacrifice of the Masters for the world, then the very next line is, here then is the fourth and last stage on the soul's long journey, the redemption. To those who offer light, the little light that is in them, into the infinite light of God. And that's us, that the life of an avatar, the complete giving over of yourself for the sake of others, is where we're going to. I mean, not just maybe, but that's what we have to become. We have to become God Himself, which is an endless flow of infinite bliss and an endless flow of unconditional love. And so what the Masters also show us by their profound realization is our own destiny. The most fascinating, one of the most fascinating things to contemplate is that every one of the Masters attained realization. And therefore, every stage of delusion that anyone has ever lived through, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahasaya, Sri Yukteswar, Paramhansa Yogananda, they all lived through it. Which means wherever you are, wherever I am, whatever balance of understanding and ignorance there is in our own consciousness, all of those Masters not only understand it, but have experienced it, have faced it, have untied the knot of delusion and become free. Nothing to hide on our part, nothing to be ashamed or embarrassed about. Whatever we are, they have been. And what they are now, we will become. And with that, the complete confidence of a child, then we can stand before these Masters without the slightest reservation and invite their consciousness into our own and lift ourselves into their reality to be one of those who received Him and from Him receive the power to become free as they are free. So God bless you.